said, that of the need for sticky sessions, is to introduce a central database. Well, this is kind of a step backwards, right? We've scaled the web front end, but the database back end now is still consolidated in one machine. So what's going to be a solution there? Not just have one database, but have multiple databases. But now we need to balance the load on the databases, and so the picture starts to get a little messy. So we'll come back to this story. Thankfully, databases can, in fact, scale a little more readily than us doing it manually with load balancing. What would be another solution to this problem? Suppose you can't have a database. And suppose you don't know how to set up a database, so you got to come up with something else. Or you can't afford a database. Any number of constraints could exist here. What else could you do if the problem at hand is that /temp is unique per server? Yeah. All right. So, right, some of you probably have like file servers in your dorm rooms or at home, which is just a hard drive that's somehow shared on the network so that multiple people can access it. That feels like what we kind of need here, right? Why don't we just introduce a server into the picture, or use one of the servers and have him share his /temp directory or some other directory to all of the other servers? This would seem to solve the problem. You can use technologies like NFS, Network File System, AFS in the Mac world, and there's a whole bunch of protocols that allow you to share file systems across the network. Feels nice. I don't have to know anything about MongoDB or MySQL or any databases, but downside? Yeah.
Are we against centralizing data in a single server?
Damn it, right? So it's kind of the same problem again. A different type of solution, but really with the same end result. We now are centralizing our hardware with just one single file server. So one, that thing itself might not scale very well. But at least, if rather than have to do all of our computation, the only thing this server is doing is serving files, maybe one file server actually does get us a little farther in the story. So it can handle 10,000 users, whereas an individual web server might only handle 1,000. But there's also this theme in scaling of single points of failure, which frankly kind of means what it says, right? Like if that server dies, you're kind of screwed. Everything is down then. Even if you have 10 actual servers, if they can't share sessions, this means no user is going to be able to log in because your site can't remember that he or she has in fact logged in. So it doesn't seem like we've really solved this all that readily. So let's come back to that in the context of databases, where we will at least have some solutions. But let's also talk about how we can make better use of the hardware we already have. So let's shelve that. We have a whole bunch of solutions. They're imperfect, but we'll come back to actually solve that a little better. But caching, we mentioned along the way, is actually kind of a good thing. So what does it mean to cache, just in general? Or what is a cache? Sorry? What's a cache? What's caching? Yeah.
A copy of files in RAM or in memory so that you can access them faster than on disk.
OK, good. So it's a copy of files in RAM or on disk so that you can access them more quickly. So what kinds of things might you want to cache when implementing a web-based architecture? What's that?
The output of a server-side script.
OK, so the output of server-side scripts, right? So something like Facebook is actually a pretty good example, even though as the years pass, it's getting more and more dynamic. But just a couple years ago, when you visited your own profile page, it was pretty much static. It might have changed a few moments ago, but it's not going to change automatically, as is the case now with nice little AJAX features pushing more and more news feeds to your page. So assume that a couple years ago, at least, your profile page might be more read-heavy or write-heavy. Which is the more likely scenario? Any arguments in one direction or the other? So it's probably more read-heavy, unless you're completely obsessed with like updating your own profile page or posting to your own wall or equivalent. Odds are for every change you make or for every comment someone makes, probably at least 2 other people look or care to see that information. So it's reasonable, at least for a typical user, that it's more read-heavy than write-heavy. Unfortunately, generating that page might have to talk to a whole bunch of tables or even a whole bunch of databases to generate all of the HTML that has your list of friends and that has your list of family, that has all of your recent wall posts, has birthdays, have comments you made. It might be spread around a whole bunch of different tables, which is to say it might take a bunch of CPU cycles and time to gather all of that information. And it would kind of suck to have to do that again and again every time one of your friends visits your profile page. So as Yellis proposes, why not do all of that expensive work once? And what's the output? It's HTML. But rather than just send the HTML directly to the browser, why don't you yourself save a copy of that HTML in a string, store it somewhere locally in RAM, or heck, even in the file system in a .html file, so that so long as I don't update my profile and another 10 users visit it, all I have to do is grab that file from disk or from RAM and spit out the exact same thing again and again and again. And I can even do that with Ajax, right? I can at least spit out 99% of the page and then do a marginal amount of more work to just get the most recent comments to insert at the top. So Craigslist has actually popularized this idea, and you actually still even see the HTML files. If we go to Craigslist.org, and let's choose Boston, and we can choose, let's see, how about apartment housing? So let's pick random one. Let's see, gorgeous 2-bedroom, granite counters, newly renovated. All right. Not the nicest backyard. All right. So the relevant part here, though, is the URL. It ends in HTML, which frankly is completely meaningless. This can be simulated, certainly these days, but odds are it actually is an HTML file. And HTML files on a file system are actually pretty compelling for performance, because we've had like 20 years of developing web servers in some form, and they're really good at just spitting out static content, grabbing something from disk and spitting it out over a network socket. That can be done really quickly these days. So in fact, if you've ever posted to Craigslist, whether for an apartment or for something else, you can, you'll probably, okay, so this side of the room knows. So, so you'll probably recall that, which now reveals I know this, you'll probably recall that you will be informed that your post will appear eventually, after some number of seconds. And you're given the URL of the admin page where you can edit it, but the listings that we just saw one page ago are not actually updated immediately. So why might that be? Like, why is it? Frankly, it's not the best user experience when sites say, you'll eventually see what you just did, whereas Facebook's pretty damn compelling in that they show you immediately. So why might that be? What's Craigslist probably doing when you post a new advert and they say the listings will be updated shortly? What are they probably doing? Yeah. Okay, good. So it's probably waiting for some number of ads, maybe 5 more ads to be posted, or for some number of minutes to pass so that there's a cron job, some scheduled process on the server that is then looping through the database, grabbing the newest posts, and updating literally the .html file that represents the listing itself and also the directory listing in the search results. So why would they do this, though? This feels like it's inserting unnecessary latency, especially in 2012. It's faster, right? And frankly, it's 2012, but Craigslist looked like this in like 1999, too. So it is faster. And the upside of that is that they probably do get by with much, much less hardware, certainly than Facebook. I mean, Facebook has tens of thousands of servers these days. I'm guessing Craigslist's technology needs are a little more humble, for better or for worse. So storing things in files, whatever the content actually is actually a compelling thing. And you don't have to store them just on files on the file system itself. There exist mechanisms that actually streamline this for you. And Memcache daemon, Memcached, as mentioned here, is actually an incredibly popular caching engine. In the appliance, if you want to play with this, you can do yum install or sudo yum install memcached. And what it will do is install a cache server on your appliance that just listens perpetually for connections on TCP port 11211, I think, by default. There's no authentication. It's just used for local storage. And then using a few lines of PHP code, anytime you generate a huge string of HTML, you can plop it into Memcache by setting the value for a given key. And what's the key? Well, if it's a user's profile, you might have the key be 123, where that's the user's ID, and then the value is just a huge chunk of HTML. And then in whatever code you've written in PHP or whatever language to request a user's profile, what you do first is you check the cache. And if David's profile is already in the cache, grab that HTML and send that to the browser. Else, if it's not in the cache, or if it's 10 minutes old, a day old, it's probably stale, you can flush the cache, regenerate it by using your normal database queries, save it again in the cache, and then spit out the results. So this is a hugely compelling way of making a website scale without doing a huge overhaul of your architecture. Actually designing things with caching in mind and capturing the output of your PHP files before you spit out the results is a wonderful way of reducing load on databases. Databases tend to be one of the slowest pieces of any web architecture these days, certainly for something like a relational database that's transaction safe and is actually storing with very high reliability all of your data, but you pay the price for that robustness. Anyone know what the MySQL query cache is? This, too, is a trivial thing to use. And it's not often on by default. Take a guess what it does. That's right. It caches MySQL queries. And all this takes is editing a file that's usually called my.cnf, myconfig, which is somewhere in /etc usually on a Linux server. And if you set the value from 0 to 1, or actually add the line to the config file and then restart the server, what this will do is exactly that. In the future, when you execute SQL queries, the server itself will remember the result set, the rows that were returned